remember whether we do or not, but we are recording these sessions, and so they will be available on the Canvas site probably within a week. But just to let you know that we are recording, if anybody needs to change their screen name, feel free to do that. Feel free to leave your cameras off if you need to. I always appreciate cameras on because it helps me judge if my content is reaching people. But if you're not able to have your camera on, of course, that's okay too. So today we are going to be talking about resumes and cover letters. To walk back a little bit, the previous sessions that we have done, this is a diagram of the job search process that we show every time. The previous sessions have really been around self-assessment, looking internally, understanding, sometimes the loss of identity that comes along with this job search, understanding what your interests, skills, experiences are. Last week, we covered exploring and researching. Today, we're going to talk about resumes and cover letters. And then next week, we'll briefly touch on interviews and offer evaluation and negotiation. As we talk about every week, this is the preparation for your job search. You will spend more time on it. This is an overview, sort of 101 session. The focus is on jobs beyond academia. The sessions support each other, but also can be used independently. Today, we actually are, in the beginning of the session, going to do a little bit of typing things in the chat. I know probably a few people are just in listen mode somewhere else, but if you are able to participate just for the first few minutes, we're going to do some kind of question and answer in the chat. And I want to point out that particularly for resumes and cover letters, folks often like to see examples. In the Canvas site, we have some great examples and templates that you can use when you are writing these documents, since we will not be able to obviously showcase everything today. So remember, that is in the Canvas site and available to you. So please check those out. Okay, resumes. So let's talk a little bit about resumes. In the chat, for those who are willing to do this, let's spend maybe a couple minutes typing, what is the purpose of the resume? Just briefly, what's the purpose of a resume? Great, I see. Highlight your relevant qualifications and experiences, show skills and experiences, show skills and fit with the job. Yes, good. Showing credentials, yep. Overview skills and qualifications, yes. Those are the basic things that go into the purpose of a resume. The reason I ask this question is because what I want to point out is a resume is a very effective tool for helping you get an interview. It does not get you a job. It gets you an interview along with, maybe some networking, doing some research, talking with people, but it is not intended to get you the job. And so there's a hard part about that once you do the resume, then you actually have to do the interview too to get a job. But the nice part about that is it doesn't have to say everything about you, right? It only has to give the qualifications, the skills that will get your foot into the door so that you actually get that interview. So remember this. This document's not everything, it's the highlights about you. Okay, great. Introduction to the hiring peer review on paper. Yep. Okay, so let's look at the next type in the chat question. What's the difference between a CV and a resume? Okay, I see a resume is one page and it's your highlights. Your CV is everything. CV is academic. CV is for academic jobs. Absolutely. So a resume is one, maybe 2 pages, depending on the amount of experience you have in the job. It's the highlights for you. It's skill-based. It talks about the skills that you have. A CV is for academic positions, right? It's qualifications-based. It's big lists of things. It's everything about you. And so they are very different documents. And I point this out because I often get the question, how do I translate my CV to a resume? And I would say how you do it is you don't. They're 2 very different documents. And so I would talk about sort of building a resume using materials that might be on your CV, but they're 2 very different documents. So I would not try to translate one to another. Okay, next question. I'm going to show you a resume. Those of you, this will be a lot easier for those of you who are actually on screens, not on phones. But I'm going to show you a resume, and I want you to just take a look at it. And then we're going to ask some questions. Okay, so here's a resume. Take a look. I'm going to give you a little bit of time, and then I'll have you type some things in the chat. Okay. So in the chat, what do you know about that candidate? What do you remember? What did you notice? What sticks in your memory? Go ahead and type anything that you remember in the chat. Just a couple things. Like music, okay. Harvard, yep. You notice where did they go to school, right up at the top. Teaching experience, okay. Applying for institutional experience. Juilliard, yep. Multiple degrees, worked with professors. About academic experiences. They're an academic, okay. Who remembers some really significant details about a skill that was in the resume? Mixed with serious, not clear what they're looking for professionally. Violin, okay, yep. Okay, I do this to point out that I think I gave you, I'm going to say about 14 seconds to look at this resume. If you were to guess how long an initial scan of your resume gets, if a person is scanning it, how long would you think? Type in the chat. How long do you think your resume gets in an initial scan? 30 seconds, 7 seconds, 10 seconds. Yep, 10 seconds. Yep. Okay. It was funny. I was just watching a TV show. I was watching Frontline last night, and they said the average human recruiter gives you 3 seconds. But data will vary a little bit, but yes, it is in the seconds. It's not minutes, and it's probably less than 30 seconds. And so I point this out for this reason, that the things that you notice are probably the things that the recruiter is noticing at the beginning as well. So if we're to pull it back up, right, we're going to look the way people look at it, right? We're going to look at like, where are the degrees from? And then we're going to say like, oh, this person has teaching, mentoring. Maybe I noticed some words that I clue into, like I'm a violinist or I'm a musician. I clue into those words. And then I might say like, oh, they're at Harvard, they're a teaching fellow. They were a proctor, they're a violin teacher, and that's about as far as I get. And if I, as a recruiter, am like, not interested, if it's too hard to read, forget it. That's it. Your resume goes to the I am not interested pile. And so for that reason, I always say format matters. Format matters a lot more than people think it does, because what happens is that if the recruiter skims your resume and says, yep, it's a good school, it's a decent degree, right? I understand, like I need somebody who can teach a little bit. That person looks like they taught before. Then I might go back and give the person a couple minutes to look at it. So, but if it's not skimmable, if I can't easily look at it in 3 to 10 seconds, it's going to go in the no pile. So format really matters. It needs to be skimmable. It needs to be consistent when we go back and look at this resume. I would say that's really good in consistency, right? The things are bolded, that are the names. The positions are in italics. They have it laid out as teaching, mentoring, right? This is only the first page. If you go to the second page, you'd find some other things. It's easy to see where the degrees are from. And so that's a very skimmable resume to me. Now, I'm not saying I would want everything that person has, but it's very skimmable, and that's important. You'll notice that resume uses headers, capitalization, bold, and italics, but not in excess. If it's in excess, it makes it really hard to read. It's bullet points, right? People can't read paragraphs. It's too hard to read paragraphs when you're skimming. And usually there are exceptions for this, but usually we do a resume in reverse chronological order, where your relevant work experience is the oldest positions go at the bottom, the most recent positions go at the top. Okay, so what might the categories and section headers on your resume be? I'm going to tell you, they're going to vary by person and the job, because things are important in some jobs that are not important in other jobs. So everybody's going to have their name heading. Some people choose to have a summary. We're going to talk a little bit about that. your education, which may go right at the top, and it might not. If it's not a selling point, it might go near the bottom. Your relevant experience. Sometimes people have leadership, their relevant research, community engagement, honors and awards. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And sometimes folks, when they have technology skills or other relevant, what I would call like technical skills, not basic or foundational skills, people will put lists of those in there too. So this is probably not news to anybody. Unlike a CV, which is probably mostly consistent as you're applying to jobs, a resume has to be tailored for a specific job. Now, if you're applying for similar sorts of jobs, if you're applying for project manager jobs at various nonprofits, there might be 90% overlap. So you're not going to have to tailor each bullet point. But you are going to have to tailor for jobs because, again, it is the things that are relevant to the job, relevant about you, and not the things that are not relevant. So you're going to have to pull some things out. You want to mirror the keywords from the job posting. I'll show an example of that. You want to focus on the relevant skills. I sometimes throw things into like a word cloud to see what those are. I'll show an example of that. And one point that I think is really important, people will say to me, how do I know if that belongs in my resume? This particular experience, this particular skill set. And what I will say is, if it is relevant to the job, if it is telling the employer something about you, put it on there. If it doesn't, if it's irrelevant to the employer, take it off. It just detracts. It's space on your resume that is being taken up by something that isn't irrelevant to the person, and it's going to subtract from the experience. So add it if it's important, take it off if it's not important. So let's just take a look at a basic, here's a basic job description, right? If I am looking at this and I'm starting to think about writing my resume, I might do something like this, as we talked about. I'm going to highlight the things that are important. I'm going to look at the job description, and I'm going to say, right, research, outreach, implementation, planning and executing, building targeted outreach, preparing creative communications, right? I'm going to look at that. I'm going to look particularly at the qualifications, experience in design, organization, delivery, ability to independently identify, design written and verbal communication plans. And so for those things that they want me to have or to be able to showcase, I need something on my resume that will show them I have done those things. If you hadn't done them and you have nothing relevant, you can't put it on there. And that is usually the case. I think we talked, maybe it was last week or the week before, you will never meet all of the qualifications and you don't need to. But for qualifications that you do meet, you want to showcase those on your resume, because an employer has no way to know if you have the skill or the experience if you don't let them know about that on your resume. So this is one way of doing it. I can just go through a job description, and I recommend doing this and highlighting the things that you need to make sure you're showcasing in your resume. I also like this idea of throwing it into a word cloud where I can look like, what are the important concepts? You are going to see words like and the, because those are very common words, but I basically take the text, throw it into word cloud, and I can see like engagement, that's an important one. Activities, that's an important word. Energy, that's an important word. And so we're going to talk a little bit about applicant tracking systems, which are electronic systems. But even if an individual person is reading your resume, they are keyword searching, right? It's just the way the human brain works. And so you want to make sure the key skills, concepts, and words from job descriptions are in your resume. Okay. When we're looking at effective content, right, we've talked about keywording. I never used to think that summaries were important, but I think they're particularly important for folks who are who are getting a PhD, who are looking outside of a traditional academic job. And I say that because a summary can cue the reader up to say, this is who I am, right? We looked at that last resume and somebody said, oh, that person's an academic. And that's great if you're applying for an academic posting, right? That's perfect. But if you're applying for a project manager posting and the first thing the person thinks is that's an academic, unhelpful, right? And so if you write a summary that's kind of in this aspirational language, which we'll talk about, it can cue the reader up to say, oh, this is a project management, an aspiring project management professional. In my brain, I'm thinking of them as that way. And when I read the content, it will fit into that idea that I already have in my brain. Summaries are often written in a paragraph or sentence form just without the pronoun of I. We don't use I's in resumes. The rest of the content we talked about will be keywords and bullet points. We're going to talk about that too, how to write an effective bullet point. Okay, so I think this is a decent summary that somebody has written to be a project manager that's got a little bit of creative side, right? It starts out by saying project manager. You're queuing the reader up to be like, this is the person that I want to be. Now, clearly, if you've never done project management, you can't say that, right? But there are a lot of people who are in PhD programs who have done a significant amount of project management during their PhD program. And so if that is a fair thing to state about yourself, you can say that. So you're queuing them up to think of you as a project manager. If you spent 10 years in your PhD program, or 3 years before your PhD and 7 years in your PhD program, you've got 7 years of experience. Here's the things you've done: educational publications, public outreach. A lot of you have done public outreach in various capacities. And so, that's often something you can say on that. So this is how I would write a summary to cue the reader up. This is the kind of position I'm looking for. It isn't necessary. I've seen very effective resumes that don't have a summary statement, but when you are switching sectors, you're trying to go to different sectors, different kind of job, this can really be helpful in queuing the reader up. Effective bullet points. So when you are deciding what to include on your resume, when you are writing a bullet point, if you're going to say, I have been the instructor of record for a course, what should you include in there? If you include in there, things like instructor of record for, social sciences 5902, that means nothing to the reader, right? They're like, I don't know what instructor of record is. I don't care what the number of the course is. That doesn't tell me anything. And so you want to think about, when you're writing a bullet point, what skill, going back to the job description, or what experience, what are you trying to prove to that person? What are you trying to showcase? If you're trying to showcase that you are a good instructor, trainer, right, you're an effective communicator in front of a group of people, you write your bullet point around that. So think about what you're trying to accomplish with your bullet point. A bullet point in general is a skill. Here's the thing that I'm doing. Here's the details of that. And here's what came out of that. There's also a way to do it in the reverse. And I know that certain, particularly large companies, sort of like this format where you would say, what I accomplished is this, my result is this, start result first, and then I'm going to write the skills that I use. I did this by doing this and this. And so that's another way to write an effective bullet point. So your skill is your action verb. We'll look at action verbs. The detail is how you did this, and the result is what you accomplished. Sometimes that is either impossible or it will feel really forced. If you're like, I don't know. I can't make a guess about what the result was that. I'm really trying to showcase this skill. It's okay. You don't need a result on every bullet point. Bullet points are very important to a resume. But the thinking used to be, and I remember when I first started career services, we would spend hours fine-tuning bullet points. Like, we got to make this exactly right. And we're going to have we're going to have a competition. How do you write the best bullet point? And then when we realized how recruiters are looking at resumes, it's not that important. They need to be good. They need to be solid. They need to be like 80%. But do not spend 100 hours fine-tuning a bullet point if they are basically in this format, because it doesn't get you very far. If you are showcasing a skill, that's what you want to be doing. In my experience, particularly PhD students spend way too much time on resumes and not enough time on the other things that are really important: research by talking to people, learning about companies, learning about the language within it. Compared to those things, resumes are actually probably much less important. I think they feel easier to do to many PhD students, but don't spend an over amount of time on your resume. Once it is good enough, it's good enough. Okay. So let's look at effective skills verbs that you could be using. On the right-left challenge, on my right-hand side, you see what I would consider like weak ones. And these are things I see very often where people say like, I was responsible for implementing this project. And I'm like, I don't know what that means. Responsible just tells me that you're responsible. Or I worked on a paper. Okay, well, worked isn't very, or I assisted with something. I don't know what you did. And if I can't envision what you did, it's not helpful for me as a reader. So stronger things are like, I managed something, I coordinated, I organized, I budgeted, trained, collaborated, those words that you're going to see in the job description. But if you find yourself using things that are on my right-hand side, try to think of a more accurate verb, a more accurate skill for what you're doing, because they just don't tell very much. Every once in a while, you'll be like, I can't think of anything else but worked. That's the best I can do. And if I have to spend more time, I'm going to be here till tomorrow. Okay, again, not worth it, but to the best of your ability, use really strong skill verbs, because it actually tells the reader what you were doing, and that's what they're interested in. Okay, so let's start with just a simple statement. So some of you have done tutoring, and a bullet point could be, I tutored students last summer. Or in a resume, we would take out the I and just say tutored students last summer. Okay, that's great, right? A lot of us know what tutoring is, so it's probably okay, but it doesn't really tell me very much. So to make it stronger, you can think through to yourself, okay, who did I tutor? What's the detail that needs to go in there? What did I tutor that I'm on? Can I quantify anything about this? What were the skills that I used? And so a better bullet point can look something like, tutored over 25 high school students weekly in ACT materials. And I did this by utilizing a peer-to-peer teaching model. That's some detail that's really important. I want to know, how did you do that? And this resulted in a 23% average increase. Okay, that's the part where sometimes people are like, I don't know if I have a 23, but if you know that, you can put it in there. It is okay to say, if you have a decent idea, like, I think I'm really pretty sure it increased it by about 25%. You can say about, you don't have to have an exact number. And if you don't have a number, you leave it off. The last thing I think that I want to talk about with resumes is translating things like lists of publications, awards, fellowships. Sometimes people will say, you know, I have this many publications and I have this many awards. Should I list them all? And I always think, when you're trying to, again, decide what to include on a resume, what is the point of what you're trying to include? If it's a project management role, they probably don't care the topics of the papers that you published. It's just not important to them. So what's the point? What are you trying to prove? What will the employer care about? Is it with fellowships that you can bring in money? You know, if you're able to get things published, it's because you're good. Is it a good writer? If you're getting awards, is it saying like, I'm well respected? So sometimes people will say things like, you know, published 27 articles in 13 different journals. I'm making this up, right? Or received awards in total of $50,000. So those prove something to the recruiter or the employer, without having to list out things that people don't care very much, which is titles, the names of the journals. You know, outside academia, people don't know those things, so there's no point listing them. I like this quote. I had a student write an evaluation, you know, a piece of advice about things like publications. Instead of listing my publications, I should list the competencies, right? And this is what we're talking about. What is it that the recruiter cares about? The competencies, the skills, and then they will care, right? I use these skills, or this is the thing I am trying to prove by that list. So always be asking yourselves, what's the skill, competency, whatever I'm trying to prove by what I'm putting on my resume. Okay. Oh, last thing I did want to briefly touch on, and then we'll touch on cover letters and we'll open up for questions. I get a lot of questions about applicant tracking systems, sometimes all called ATS. And that is the electronic software that large companies, particularly tech companies, will use to get a first scan at your resume. So smaller companies, nonprofits, even the University of Minnesota, right? The applicant tracking system is a human being. They're going through and keyword searching right in their human being mind. There are now sophisticated applicant tracking systems, right? They're using some form of artificial intelligence and some other things and keyword searching to essentially replace what a human being would be doing. I think they're interesting to learn about if you are particularly interested in the tech sector, because there are some ways of making your resume better in an applicant tracking system that might look different than if it's being screened by a human being. This doesn't apply to everybody. You know, for those of you who are applying to jobs that are outside of these large companies that aren't using these systems, I wouldn't spend too much time worrying about it, but you know, they are getting increasingly used. So some of the things are the same, right? Matching keywords. I'm using this chronological format, sometimes a hybrid format, using the standard section headings, creating a skills section. But I think what is important is the don't section. And I think this actually rings true for a lot of human beings too. Tables, columns, graphics, headers, and footers do not translate well in applicant tracking systems. Maybe for human beings, right? We like, that's a nice gray box over there. Like their skills are called out over here on the left-hand side. They don't translate well in applicant tracking systems. And so if you know that you're going to a large company, stick to a very standard format like the one that we showed before. I actually think that a lot of human beings still like that format too, but human beings are a little bit more able to process boxes and gray zones and things like that. So again, I think this is in the Canvas course, this particular resource is really good about walking through applicant tracking systems and talking about what they look for and how to best tailor your resume for that. So for those of you looking at large companies, I'd recommend you look at that. Okay, let's quickly take a look at cover letters. You know, once you've spent some time looking at a job description and thinking through your resume, a cover letter in some ways comes a lot easier because you've already thought through what are the things that I want to highlight to that company or that organization. So the purpose of a cover letter, right, is to introduce your resume. It's to be able to give some narrative to your story. This is really probably more important for people who, again, are using a degree to do something that was traditionally not meant to do. You know, I'm going to be a project manager and I am really being trained to be an academic, because it gives you ability to give some narrative. So to introduce your resume, to say, here's the story of who I am and why it makes sense I'm applying for your position, even though I am getting a PhD in English. So introduce your resume. It needs, of course, to be targeted. It is not used in every position. Increasingly, I would say, particularly in the tech sector, you don't need a cover letter. So a cover letter would accompany many resumes, but sometimes you don't even need one. It's one page. Sometimes it's called like a letter of introduction, a letter of intent, an application letter, something like that. But the basic idea is the same. And so you'll see various formats for cover letters. People have different formats that they use that are all pretty good, right? All of this stuff is a little bit of an art, not a science, but I tend to think about it as this way. The first paragraph is kind of what motivates you to apply for this position. So, and I think this is particularly important, again, for many PhDs. So you want to let them know why you're interested in the employer, why you're interested in the position, coming from the background where you are, because sometimes it won't make sense to an employer. I don't understand why this PhD in English is applying for my project manager position. That doesn't make sense to me. But you have a chance in the first paragraph to say, here's why I'm interested in that. Here is why I'm interested in your particular organization. Maybe you're a nonprofit that focuses on refugees, and maybe you've done your work in that kind of topic area. So why are you interested in that? And I think that's pretty key. The second paragraph, you can bring out the highlights of the top things that you're bringing to the employer. Again, not everything, but if you were to think of like the top 3 things you're bringing, that can go in the middle paragraph. The last paragraph is closing. Thank you. I look forward to hearing from you type of thing. So keep it simple and keep it short. Cover letters can get really long and convoluted, and there's not much point to that. It'll take too much of your time and it probably won't get read. So here is a basic one. The thing I want to point out about this is in a more of a traditional format. Dear hiring manager, I'm ready to express my interest. Here's the things I bring: 2 years of experience in editing, seminar logistics fellowship program. I like reversing the first and the third paragraph where I said, start with your motivations. I'd be excited to join the Humanity Centered team. It has appealed to me because, right, to me, I think that belongs in the first paragraph because it helps explain to me as a reader why you are applying for my position, where when I'm looking at your resume, it might not make as much sense. So So that's why I put that kind of stuff first. But again, this would be a traditional format and it would work as well. And all of these examples I'm pulling out of the Canvas course. This one again probably is from the Harvard packet, but there's plenty of examples in there. The last thing I want to say is in the Canvas course, and this is what I would recommend when people say, how do I translate my CV to a resume? And I'm like, you don't. And then people are like, but how do I even get started? I'm like, use the worksheet. So we have a really good worksheet that will help you think through what you want to include. Often people just start writing without thinking, what am I really trying to write this about? So this worksheet, which you probably can't see super well on the slide, right? But it'll say like, what are the 3 to 5 points you're trying to communicate? Give me the summary of how your qualifications meet what they're looking for. And so it's a good way to get yourself started rather than taking your CV, spending an hour looking at it, and then trying to translate it over here and ending up with a document that doesn't have anything to do with the job posting. And so I really like this basic worksheet as a way to get started on these documents, particularly if you haven't done them before. Okay, let's open it up for questions. We can start out with questions about resumes and cover letters. And then if we run out of those, we can always move into sort of general questions. But I would say go ahead and either raise your hand and unmute yourself, or you can type it in the chat. Carolyn will probably read those and then we can get answering.
We do have one in the chat from Megan. Megan asks, if a job asks for either a CV or a resume, which do you pick? Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. I would say it depends on the job you're applying to. Like if it's a research type opportunity, then maybe a CV, talking about your teaching, some publications, research you've done might be helpful. If it's a more applied based job, a resume with more skill oriented or outcome based things might be the one that you pick. So it really depends on the job and the task that they're going to be asking the candidate to be able to do. So that's my perspective. What about you, Mackenzie?
Yeah, I think I would agree. If they say either, to be honest with you, I'd probably be like, what do I have on hand that's most applicable so that I'm spending less time if I don't have to, and I can spend more time actually talking to people about this job. So if it says either, they usually truly mean either. My guess would be that is either a more academic focused position or an organization that is full of PhDs and knows how to read a CV, as though it was a resume. So, I think Carolyn's basic is right. You want to figure out what's most applicable. But if you're like, it's 6 one, half dozen the other, I'd go with what do you have, right? And then how can you spend the time you would have spent rewriting a document, networking with people and making good use of your time. My opinion, I don't know if Maria's here or if Drew, you have an opinion on those, or we can go to the next question.
I would say the only exception is sometimes resume and CVs are used interchangeably for international opportunities. And so we do have a resource on Handshake. It's called Going Global that it gives some like resume or job search information about specific like countries and things like that. So that would be the one thing to consider, is that if it's an international organization or organization based in another country, is CV the language they use for a resume, and what does that look like, and how do you tailor it to meet that with the cultural needs of that that organization?
Yeah, super good point. Know what, when they say those words, what do they mean?
Thanks, Megan. Other questions that popped up for folks? All right, we have one here about salary requirements. Recent job app asks for salary requirements within the cover letter. How would you recommend integrating that information? It felt kind of awkward to put it in there. And so thoughts about like how to incorporate salary, maybe expectations into the cover letter. Yeah, Drew or Mackenzie, do you either one of you want to chat about this one?
I feel like there are online resources to kind of gauge some sort of range to think about. Something like Glassdoor might be a resource for you if it's, kind of a broad job title like project manager or something like that, to kind of get a sense of it. I think that's a good question to ask. It's a good reason to do a few informational interviews as well, to find a few folks within that specific industry or even company, to be like, hey, I'm really, this is kind of an awkward situation. And I agree, it is an awkward situation to have to kind of explicitly put a number there, but to be able to reach out to somebody first would be my advice.
Yeah, and we are going to talk specifically around next week around offers and negotiations and how to benchmark. And I think maybe part of this question as well is like in a cover letter, like where does that go? And I agree, that's a little weird. Usually you see it as a separate question. My gut reaction is to say, put it in the last paragraph or the second to the last paragraph. I wouldn't lead with it. And my general advice is give a range. It says, what's your salary requirements? I'm hoping to make between $60,000 and $90,000. And I will talk about that next week, like broad ranges. But I think I would just, it's awkward in a cover letter because that's not a usual item. But if they want you to put that in there, you need to, and I would not lead with it. I'd put it towards the bottom.
Yeah, another resource that might be helpful or something to know is there are certain states that require job salary or at least ranges. And so I think like California, Colorado are a couple that come to mind. I'll share a link to an article that I just pulled off of Google of some of those states. And so that's a nice place to look to see for some similar jobs or jobs within the same industry or within the same title, looking it up in those specific states to see what are the ranges available. And then also knowing what's your non-negotiable number too. And so don't say 60 if you're not willing to settle for 60. And be honest and know that like if they did offer you the lower range, would you be accepting of that? And so a lot of times our graduate level students are also balancing family or thinking about relocation and things like that. And so know what's a comfortable range for you and the lifestyle that you have or the responsibility you hold as well too. And I was also mimic third into the bottom half of your cover letter. All right, there's another one here about informational interviews. I have already had informational interviews and I work within the company. Should that affect the resume or cover letter I provide? For example, I can expect my resume might get a few minutes rather than a few seconds. Yeah, so I'm guessing like is the question is the question if you've had a networking opportunities, does that impact the way that you write your resume? Do you want to clarify that a little bit, Lindsay?
I have a quick short answer on that just sort of addresses this in general, but Lindsay, if I'm not addressing this, let me know. Yes, if you have talked to somebody in the company or organization, certainly you want to know that you have their permission. It wouldn't go in a resume, but it certainly can go in a cover letter. I have talked with, Ahmad Jensen, and they said that this company was an excellent place for PhDs in English to work because, intellectual thinking is valued by your company. I don't know. Okay, I'm making it off the top of my head, right? But it's hard to name drop for the sake of name dropping, but if you can say, I've talked to this person, this is what I learned, and this is why I'm so interested in your company, that's valuable. To say like, I talked to XYZ, these three people, I don't know, it feels a little name droppy to me, but I always think it's a good idea to name drop if you can say, here's the reason I'm name dropping. Although, of course, we all know part of the reason you're name dropping is to show that you've already been working a little bit to get into that company. So that's the way I usually would handle it. And yeah, I do think often if you have spent the time talking with somebody, your resume might get a little bit more time, but I would put that in a cover letter.
Okay, thank you. I guess part of my question was coming from, that was a great, super useful answer too. But like, we were highlighting how short people look at your resume. And I know that like, I don't know, like if I've got an old friend from undergrad who works somewhere, so I can hand them my resume to hand to a manager, can I then style my resume a little bit less for the 30-second glance and a little bit more for like the 2-minute read, where I'm maybe going into a little more depth with skills and a little bit less, I need to grab you in 5 seconds? Like, is there, or we should just assume everyone always looks for like less than 30 seconds, even if it's being handed over?
Yeah, I think, I mean, to some extent, when we're saying like you get like the 30 seconds or the, you know, the 10 seconds in the beginning, that's the initial, right? But if they're interested, they will spend a little bit more time on it. So to me, I'm not sure they would look much different, right? You still want something that's skimmable, but that has the details in it if they're interested. I would just assume that they will go into the details, I think. I don't know, Carolyn, Drew, any other nuances on that?
I don't know that it would impact like the length of your resume too, or your cover letter too much. I think as a candidate, I always tell this to students, like part of your job is to make it as easy as possible for the employer to say, yes, we want you to come in for an interview, because the purpose of the resume is to get you an interview. It typically doesn't get you the job offer. And so you want it to be enticing enough, but not spilling all of the detail. And so that's sort of the double-edged sword of a lengthier resume or cover letter too, is that if you're giving them all the detail, all the information, then how can you continue to influence their decision in that interview as well too? And so I don't think that needs to be like a longer, but maybe the order in which you put your skill statements, or maybe adding more specific examples if you've already done some informational interviews and you know what kind of skills they might be leaning more towards. Like that might be how you tailor your material if you've had opportunities to connect with folks who work for the organization or who are in a similar roles. So yeah, I'd say length might not be so much, but the specific information you share might shift a little bit based off of those information that you learned from folks. No, thanks for that question, Lindsay.
So I see another one. When writing
Mhm.
bullet points, is it okay to have multi-line bullet points, or should you stick to a single line to make them fast and easy to read?
I would say my general rule of thumb is no more than 2 lines. I think it's totally fine to go past the 1. It's really hard to stick to the 1. There are some tips in formatting that can help, such as your margins. I usually set mine to like a 0.5 so that I can fit in a little bit more space in there. Depending on the font style you use, you could go down to as small as like a 10, just making sure that it still looks readable and balanced with the white space. Fonts styles that are a little bit of a thinner font might allow you to put in more information without it looking overcrowded. But ultimately, like I would say, like if you are feeling like there's a need to have more information, where is that need coming from? Is it fear? Is it excitement? You know, what's drawing you to that need to over explain or under explain as well too? And so I'd say generally like a good rule of thumb for when I talk to students is 2 lines. Great. Other questions that are popping up for folks, whether resume and cover letter specific or broader for career as well too. Yeah, for sure. Megan. Okay. Are there fields of study specific resume resources available? What do you share with students, Mackenzie?
I'm going to say the answer is yes. Yes, there are. It's, you know, yes, there are. It takes some digging, right? I mean, I work with, I don't know. I mean, Maria's here, so she's probably going to correct me because I'm probably wrong here, but I don't know. I think we have 30 different departments or something like that, and like 36 different programs within those 30 departments. I'm not really sure, right? So somebody has written something like it is a really good example of an English resume. Somebody's a PhD in English, but I'd also say, of course, then you have to look at what they're applying for. So yes, those things can be out there. Sometimes, depending on the professional association, they can have some good examples. You know, grain of salt, sometimes the professional associations are academics trying to show you a good example of a resume, and that's not helpful, right? But sometimes they truly, you know, work with outside people who do know resumes. And so the answer is there can be, but there's not one source that's going to be for every discipline. So I have a few professional associations that I'll refer students to, but there are also some things that I'll say, don't look at their stuff because I don't actually think that's a good example. And I would think about it more, you know, maybe less around the specific area of study and more around what does a good resume look like for a project manager or for UX researcher, and kind of tailoring yourself to that. I don't know. That's my very long answer.
Yeah, using job postings as a way to gauge what to put for your resume is a helpful point. And thanks for providing some context that you're coming from an engineering perspective, Megan. I'd say that the field of engineering or like STEM related, CSE, awesome. Yay, thank you, Lindsay. The STEM fields tend to be they tend to like to see technical skills. And so if you know that a field is looking for particular sets of skills or like programming language or, you know, like specific skill sets that come with like training or practice, though you can tailor your resume to meet those needs, as well as embedding in some of those interpersonal skills, communication, connection, because oftentimes you might be working with people as well too. And so knowing what the good ratio is will be helpful, and then knowing what particular things are an organization looking for, or what are the gaps out there, how are they trying to grow in the future. That'll help you think about the ways that you can support an organization or specific roles growth. But yeah, a lot of professional associations, some of the career services offices have grad templates and things like that. LinkedIn is also a good place to do research, looking up some folks or alumni who have gone into similar programs or fields or positions you're interested in, and reviewing how they write their experience sections. Also a nice way to do that as well too. Thanks for that resource, Lindsay.
Yeah, and good tip on the Career Center, right? We are representing 2 career centers here today and the grad school, right? But there are career centers for almost every college at the university, some sort of career resource, and many of them have graduate specific help. So, you know, utilize your own career center if you have one. Okay, anything else? All right, I don't see any other questions. We will stick around for the next 6 minutes. If anybody, you know, doesn't want to talk in a big group, would like to chat in a small group. But short of that, have a good week. Hope to see many of you next week for our very last session on interviewing and negotiations. Yeah, have a good week and a good weekend.
Thanks, everyone. Drew, is there an eval link?
Yes, there is. Shoot. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
We could, and I don't know, we might be able to
We
email
could
it.
email it too. Yeah.
Okay. You'll get it in an email, Megan.
Yeah, I
Thanks for
will.
asking.
I
Sorry
forgot
about
about
that, y'all.
No problem.
folks who are still here. Do you have questions?
No.
Okay, I just removed Benjamin. I think he was probably out, off doing something. So,
Yeah,
okay.
great.
Alright.
4 down, 1 more to go.
Yep. Okay, so we have 31.